Here we are in Chapter 9. This is about conflict and change in our state. Stock prices fell drastically and rapidly during the panic of 1929 when the New York Stock Exchange collapsed. The United States experienced the worst depression in its history. By the early 1930s, the Great Depression had begun. Mississippi had already experienced economic trouble in the 1920s, so the depression of the 1930s hit the state especially hard. So, this is why we were so affected by the Great Depression and the stock exchange collapse. Mississippi farmers were prosperous at the end of World War I because wartime demand had driven up the price for cotton. So when we ended Chapter 8, we had talked about how only about 56,000 Mississippians were involved in fighting in World War II. So it didn't really necessarily affect the state, but it did affect them economically because people needed cotton to make the uniforms and things. So Mississippi got a lot of money from that. The end of World War I brought a decline in the demand and price of cotton, so many farmers had to work to pay off debt. So they were at a high and then they hit a low because there was no more demand for cotton because the war was over. So cotton production decreased in the 1920s. Another problem for Mississippi farmers. Farmers could not maintain a decent standard of living given their income and the cost of seed, fertilizer, extra help, and getting. So the extra help part, because there was no more slavery, they couldn't really afford to pay people to help them harvest their crops. So they were falling behind. The boll weevil, a pest from Mexico, was the most serious threat to cotton production during the 1920s. The boll weevil laid its eggs in a cotton boll, and the cotton boll was eaten once the weevils hatched. And by the 1920s, this little bug here had destroyed thousands of acres of cotton. In 1919 and 1920, annual rainfall was several inches above normal, and the weevils multiplied rapidly during those years. Methods that were meant to control them in dry seasons did not work well during wet seasons, so they had no way to keep this pest off of their cotton, and it was just destroying acre upon acre of cotton. There was also the Great Flood. 1927 was the wettest year on record in Mississippi, not from rainfall, but from the Great Flood on the Mississippi River. The Great Flood on the Mississippi River cost the state an entire crop. It cost them a whole year's worth of crops. If you remember all the way back in Chapter 1, we talked about the Great Flood, and we talked about how it destroyed an entire year's worth of crop. This is just a little chart that tells you about who was poorest, which was a day laborer, and who was the wealthiest, which was a landowner back then. So with the decline of cotton in the 1920s, some farmers saw promise of a better livelihood in livestock and dairying. Livestock was important to the economy of the South before the Civil War, but its recovery had been slowed since the war. An increase in livestock and dairy cattle provided well for a number of Mississippi farmers. Creameries, cheese plants, and condensaries at Starkville were established in Mississippi. So because of the boll weevils and the flood, they had to find an alternative, and they turned to livestock. Also, vegetable farming provided another alternative. Effort was made in the 1920s to develop a canning or processing industry to provide jobs, but the growth was slow. There were very few canning plants functioning in Mississippi, and the largest of those was a pickle factory, so there was lots of cucumbers being grown. Lumbermen were warned about using up forest resources too quickly, but ignored the warning, so natural resources were exhausted. We had that railroad boom and everything, and after the Civil War, and we used so many trees that the natural resource was exhausted. So faster growing pine trees were developed to replace all of the trees that had been cut down, and they also made a paper mill in our state and a process to make fiberboard for wood paneling. One gentleman, Mr. Crosby Sr., also found it profitable to use the pine stumps left behind after the lumber boom had passed. And somebody also created turpentine from the tree resin that could be used to produce other things. And workers who made products from tree resin were adversely affected by the Depression of the 1930s, and many workers were laid off. The condition of Mississippi's economy was the main issue during 1931's government election. They were trying to find someone that could help them get out of this depression, this funk. So Bilbo's attempts to issue revenue bonds were unsuccessful, and the state's debt just increased even farther. And then Martin Connor was elected governor in 1931, and he promoted a program of rigid economy, a balanced budget, and industrial development. So Connor was determined to improve Mississippi's national image and develop a more balanced economy. He believed that the only way for Mississippi to change its image and improve its economy was to elect honest men who conducted themselves like businessmen. Governor Connor promoted new and expanded industries as means of recovering the state's economy, as well as the reorganization of county governments. He implemented the rigid economic measures he promised before his election. Mississippi required additional revenue. We still needed more money, even after cutting expenses, so Governor Connor proposed sales tax to bring in more money. Merchants would collect the tax, but they were opposed because they believed it would reduce their sales. There were arguments between the rich and the poor about the unfairness of the sales tax. Others were in support of the sales tax, especially educators who thought that it would help save the public school system. Sales tax was implemented, and the income from it was used to balance the state's budget. And this is still used today, guys. That 0.07, I believe, is our state sales tax, a 0.7% sales tax. That is due to Governor Connor. Mission accomplished. By the time Governor Connor left office in 1936, he had paid off $12 million in debt and had more than $3 million in the treasury. Connor increased jobs thanks to industrial development, and he encouraged laborers and small farmers that prosperity came with factories rather than farms. Governor Connor went on to be the first commissioner of the Southeastern Conference in 1940. So the Balanced Agriculture with Industry program and World War II affected Mississippi as well. So we're going through so many huge things all at once, really. It's happening just one after the other. New industry increased the income of Mississippi citizens dramatically, and in the years that followed World War II, most servicemen and women settled in towns, and blacks and women pressed their demands for equal opportunity and social justice. So Governor Hugh L. White promised to continue and develop industrial growth in Mississippi after Connor did. So White admitted that he was not a professional politician, but he had once saved his city from economic collapse. So he was elected in 1935. In 1935, White was mandated to introduce the Balanced Agriculture with Industry program. The Industrial Commission and the Advertising Commission were created to implement the law. Tax exemptions and abundance of raw materials and the availability of low-wage labor made Mississippi attractive to northern industries looking for additional factories. Ingalls Shipbuilding, located at Pascagoula, was the most important industry attracted to Mississippi under the BAWI program. Ingalls was considered a heavy industry, and it paid higher wages than light industry. Mississippi towns benefited from the new plants attracted to the state under the BAWI program. World War II brought significant changes to the state of Mississippi, both good and bad. The war ended the Depression in Mississippi because there was the demand for things again, and Mississippi was able to sell them and make money off of it, and it restored prosperity to the state and the nation. Mississippi's mild climate was well suited for military installations, especially airfields and training camps. Camp Shelby in Hattiesburg and Kessler Army Airfield in Biloxi were two of the nation's largest military bases. Smaller military bases were also established in other counties, and a flight school in Jackson and several prisoner of war camps were maintained in Mississippi. So a lot of World War II activity was happening in our state due to our mild climate. Governor Thomas Bailey took advantage of the industry attracted to Mississippi. During his term as governor, the A&I Board was established, as well as the Mississippi Marketing Commission. Governor Bailey also promised a farm-to-market road system, which made it easier for farmers to get their products to the market. Wartime demand for manufactured products quickened the growth of Mississippi's towns and cities. New industrial jobs drew thousands of people from rural areas to urban areas. Many servicemen and women settled in towns and cities rather than returning to farms, and urbanization improved economic conditions and social customs of Mississippi. People were moving from farming cotton that wasn't doing too hot because of boll weevils and the flood and everything, and moving to factory work. Bailey was the first woman elected to a statewide office in Mississippi. After her husband Bailey passed away, she was appointed state tax collector. She ran for office and received more than half of the popular vote, and she was reelected 2 more times. So Governor Bailey's wife was state tax collector. President Harry Truman who was the president during this time, showed renewed interest in and attention to the civil rights movement. Southerners' reaction to the President Truman's interest in civil rights led to the Dixiecrat movement in 1948. Southern Democrats left the Democratic Party and formed the states' rights Democratic Party, commonly called the Dixiecrat Party. J. Storm Thurmond was nominated as president of the party, and Mr. Wright was nominated as vice president. So race had not been a significant political issue during the Great Depression and World War II. There was so much else going on that I don't want to say it went away, but it wasn't the main focus of attention anymore. Everybody was poor, everybody was suffering. But post-war conditions rekindled the race conflict. Resistance among Southern whites revived old racial hostilities. Mississippi's political leaders were aware of the increasing tensions and unrest among the blacks. So Governor White continued to stress the industrial development he promoted during his first administration, and because of the success of his industrial program, Mississippi prospered economically for a decade. Even throughout that decade, the state's per capita income remained the lowest in the nation. Governor White implemented a massive, unpopular school consolidation program during his second term, and he pushed for equalization of black and white schools in Mississippi. Trying to establish separate but equal facilities in Mississippi was nearly impossible. So the Supreme Court ruled that separate but equal principle violated the Constitution on May 17, 1954. This is a YouTube video on Brown v. Board of Education I highly recommend you watch. It explains it a little bit more clearly. 1 year after the Brown v. Board of Education of Kansas decision, public schools were meant to be desegregated with all deliberate speed. That meant as soon as possible. White Mississippians were shocked by the Brown ruling, and they were determined to prevent its implementation by any legal or constitutional means. So soon after the Brown decision, Judge Tom P. Brady wrote a book titled Black Monday, and it was published by the Citizens Council. Judge Brady declared that the Supreme Court ruling was not valid or binding, and he suggested that authorities work to prevent its implementation. In December 1954, Mississippi voters approved a constitutional amendment that authorized getting rid of the public school system altogether if it meant preventing desegregation. They said they'd rather not go to school at all than go to school with black people. Some consider the murder of 14-year-old Emmett Till the crime that started the civil rights movement. While visiting relatives in Mississippi, Emmett Till went with his cousins to a grocery store and whistled at a white woman who owned the store. Till was kidnapped, beaten, and murdered. Roy Bryant, husband to the grocery store owner, and J.Q. Millam were charged with the murder and found not guilty initially. Both men admitted they were guilty of the murder in a magazine, but they could not be tried again because of the double jeopardy clause. So they admitted that they did it after they were found not guilty, and they still could not go to jail over it. Dr. T.R.M. Howard was a surgeon and a founding member of the Regional Council of Black Leadership. He conducted an extensive campaign to gather information that might be used to bring the Till murderers to justice. Howard gave speeches nationwide about the Till murder and racial violence. The Emmett Till murder elevated Aaron Henry as a leader among African Americans in Mississippi. He was the founding member of the Regional Council of Black Leadership, and he joined the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. Henry became president of Mississippi chapter of the NAACP and formed several civil rights organizations in the state. He reaped the benefits of his efforts to bring equality to Mississippi, and he was elected to the state legislature in 1996. School consolidation, a new state constitution, economic developments, and race relations were important issues during the 1955 campaign. James P. Coleman, a racial moderate, was elected governor after an unusual campaign. He was in favor of a new state constitution, and he promised to continue school consolidation and maintain school segregation. In 1956, the legislature established a state sovereignty commission to prevent the violation of the federal government against the rights of Mississippi and other states. So now we're getting into a lot of back to racial justice and inequalities. The next chapter is about the civil rights movement.